In 1948, Hollywood's biggest secret was exposed. The studios didn't just make movies, they controlled everything. From the theaters to the stars, a few powerful men decided what America could watch. But when the Supreme Court stepped in, their empire came crashing down. But that was just the beginning of Hollywood's darkest decade. From communist witch hunts to billion-dollar disasters, here's how the movie industry's golden age almost ended overnight. Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s was like a machine. A few powerful studios controlled everything. They made the movies. They owned the theaters. They even decided which films people could watch. This was called the studio system, and it gave companies like MGM, Warner Brothers, and Paramount total control over the industry. MGM was the biggest of them all. It had 6 production lots, more than 40 cameras, and 60 sound machines running at once. At its peak, it could make up to 18 movies at the same time. But making movies wasn't enough. These studios also owned the theaters where their films played. Independent theater owners had no choice but to accept whatever the studios gave them. They had to buy movies in bundles, one big-budget film paired with a handful of smaller ones. This way, the major studios made sure their films always made it to the screen while shutting out competitors. For a while, this system worked perfectly. The biggest studios made nearly 70% of all box office earnings. But things changed in 1948 when the Supreme Court ruled that studios had to sell their theaters. That decision, combined with the growing popularity of television, marked the beginning of the end for Hollywood's golden age. But controlling the movies wasn't enough. The studios also controlled the stars. They didn't just sign actors, they created them. The Star Machine took ordinary people and turned them into legends. They gave them new names, new looks, and new identities. Cary Grant was originally Archibald Leach. Joan Crawford was born Lucille Fay Le Sueur. These transformations were carefully planned to make actors more appealing to audiences. But that was only the beginning. Actors signed 7-year contracts that gave studios full control over their careers. They couldn't choose their own roles. They couldn't refuse films. Everything they did, on screen and off, was managed by the studio. Public appearances, interviews, even friendships were planned in advance. If a star didn't follow the rules, the studio could punish them by giving them bad roles or suspending them without pay. Judy Garland was one of MGM's biggest stars. She was just 13 when the studio signed her, and they worked her non-stop. She starred in The Wizard of Oz and Meet Me in St. Louis, becoming one of the most famous actresses of the time. But behind the scenes, things weren't so glamorous. The studio put her on a strict schedule, making sure she worked as much as possible. She was given medication to stay awake during long filming hours, then given more to help her sleep. This cycle became a lifelong struggle. Years later, she said the studio had stolen her childhood. The pressure was enormous. Studios expected their stars to look perfect at all times. Weight, hairstyles, even smiles had to match what the studio wanted. Marilyn Monroe became an icon, but she faced constant pressure to maintain a certain image. The expectations were endless, and the demands never stopped. The studios even controlled relationships. They arranged dates, engagements, and marriages to make their stars more marketable. Some of Hollywood's most famous couples weren't together by choice. They were paired up to sell more tickets. If a relationship didn't fit the studio's plans, it was shut down. In some cases, actors were pressured to keep personal matters quiet if the studio believed it would affect their careers. Hollywood's golden age was built on illusion. On screen, everything looked perfect. Behind the scenes, though, a powerful system protected its biggest names while covering up the worst scandals. Those who dared to speak out were quickly silenced. In 1937, Patricia Douglas was a 20-year-old dancer, working as a film extra when she was invited to what she thought was a movie shoot. When she arrived, she realized it was something else entirely. More than 120 young women had been brought to a lavish MGM party meant to entertain a group of sales executives. The atmosphere was far from professional. Drinks were pushed on the women, whether they wanted them or not. The night turned into a nightmare when Douglas was attacked by an MGM salesman. She refused to stay silent. She went to the hospital, reported what happened, and took legal action. But the studio had too much power. The hospital, connected to MGM destroyed key evidence before it could be examined. The district attorney had close ties to Louis B. Mayer, the head of the studio, and dismissed the case without giving it a fair chance. Then came the backlash. The studio used its influence to turn the media against her. Newspapers printed her personal details, twisting the story to paint her in a bad light. Witnesses who could have supported her case were either bribed or scared into staying quiet. When she tried to file a civil suit, her lawyer failed to appear in court. Without him, the case was thrown out. Douglas was left with nothing. For decades, her story remained buried. It wasn't until the early 2000s that historian David Sten uncovered what really happened. His documentary, Girl 27, finally brought her story back into the light. While she never got justice, her bravery made her one of the first women to stand up against Hollywood's darker side. The industry ignored her at the time, but her actions helped spark conversations that could no longer be silenced. Long before the Douglas case, another scandal shook Hollywood to its core. In 1921, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was one of the most successful comedians in the film industry. He was at the top of his career when a party at a San Francisco hotel changed everything. Virginia Rapp, an aspiring actress, became seriously ill in Arbuckle's suite and passed away a few days later. Her companion accused Arbuckle of hurting her, claiming his size had caused serious injuries. The media exploded with sensational headlines. William Randolph Hearst, one of the most powerful newspaper owners, used the story to sell papers, turning Arbuckle into a villain overnight. The case went to trial 3 times. The first 2 ended without a verdict. By the third, the jury had seen enough. They took just 5 minutes to find him not guilty, even issuing a statement saying he had been wrongly accused. But it was too late. His reputation was destroyed. Hollywood studios pulled his films, and he was banned from working in the industry for years. This scandal was about more than just one man. It fueled public outrage over the growing influence of Hollywood and its stars. The industry responded by creating strict rules for filmmaking, known as the Motion Picture Production Code, or Hays Code, which controlled what could be shown on screen and how stars were expected to behave. While the public saw these scandals unfold, the real power moves happened behind closed doors. Eddie Mannix was one of the men responsible for keeping Hollywood's secrets buried. As a top executive at MGM, his job was to make problems disappear. He used money, threats, and false stories to protect the studio's reputation. One of the biggest mysteries linked to him was the death of Jean Harlow's husband, Paul Byrne. The official story was that he took his own life, but many suspected there was more to it. Some believed Byrne had a troubled past, while others thought there had been an argument between him and Harlow. Whatever the truth was, Mannix made sure the studio's version was the only one people heard. He played a similar role in Patricia Douglas's case, making sure witnesses stayed silent, either by offering them opportunities in Hollywood or by making them too afraid to speak. He wasn't the only one. Another fixer, Howard Strickling, was known for handling scandals involving stars like Clark Gable and Judy Garland. These men controlled the narrative, making sure only the stories that benefited the studios ever reached the public. That all changed in 1948. After years of legal battles, the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in with a ruling that shook Hollywood to its core. The case was United States versus Paramount Pictures, Incorporated, and its outcome forced studios to break up their empires. They could no longer own theater chains or use shady tactics to block competition. For the first time in decades, independent theaters and filmmakers had a real chance to succeed. The fight had started back in 1938 when the government sued Hollywood's biggest studios. At the time, 5 companies, Paramount, MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and RKO, controlled nearly every part of the business. 3 smaller ones, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, weren't far behind. Together, they ran a system where only their movies got the best screenings, the best marketing, and the best chances of success. One of their most powerful tactics was something called block booking. If a theater wanted a high-profile film, they had to agree to buy a whole package of movies. Some were good, but most were low-budget productions that audiences didn't care about. Theaters also had to accept blind bidding, which meant they had to pay for movies before they ever got to see them. It was for weeks before they were allowed to be shown anywhere else. Even when independent theaters did get access to major films, they often had to split the profits with the studios under unfair terms. The Supreme Court's decision put an end to all of this. Studios were forced to sell off their theater chains, which meant they could no longer guarantee a place for their films. If they wanted their movies to succeed, they had to compete, just like everyone else. This was a major blow to Hollywood's old way of doing things. For years, studios had operated like factories, churning out movies on strict schedules with actors, directors, and writers, all under long-term contracts. Now, they had to rethink everything. Without theaters automatically playing their films, studios started producing fewer movies. MGM, for example, cut its yearly output almost in half. The system of keeping actors locked into exclusive contracts also fell apart. Big stars who had once been tied to single studios now had the freedom to work wherever they wanted. This shift gave more power to actors, directors, and independent filmmakers who had been shut out of the system for so long. At the same time, a luxury only a few could afford. In 1950, only 9% of American homes had a TV. Prices had dropped dramatically. A set that once cost $500 in the late 1940s was now closer to $200, making it affordable for the average family. That was all it took. Television was no longer a novelty, it was a necessity. The impact was immediate. People started staying home. Why go to a theater, pay for tickets, and sit through a film when you could turn on a TV and watch entertainment for free? By the late 1950s, the average American family was watching 6 hours of television every day. In 1951 alone, box office sales dropped by 45%. Theaters that were once packed with eager audiences now had rows of empty seats. It wasn't just television stealing their audience. Life was changing. More families were moving to the suburbs, farther away from the big theaters in city centers. They had cars now, which meant drive-in theaters became an alternative, but even those couldn't compete with the convenience of television. Hollywood wasn't going down without a fight. If people wanted entertainment at home, studios would give them something they couldn't get anywhere else: bigger, more spectacular movies. In 1953, 20th Century Fox introduced CinemaScope, a widescreen format that made films feel larger than life. The first movie to use it, The Robe, was a hit. Other studios rushed to do the same, hoping that massive screens and sweeping visuals would bring audiences back. They also tried new technology. 3D movies like Buona Devil and House of Wax promised thrilling experiences, with taglines like "A lion in your lap" and "A lover in your arms." But the excitement didn't last. 3D required special glasses. The technology was clunky, and production costs were too high. Studios also pushed for more movies in color, better sound systems, and even experimental formats like Cinerama, which used multiple cameras to create a panoramic experience. None of it was enough. Theaters resorted to gimmicks, handing out free dinnerware or running contests to attract moviegoers. Big-budget epics like The Ten Commandments and Around the World in 80 Days became Hollywood's last hope. Massive productions designed to be seen on a grand scale. These films drew crowds, but they were expensive to make. If one flopped, a studio could lose millions. Nothing could stop the decline. In 1948, an average of 90 million people went to the movies each week. By 1960, that number had fallen to just 47 million. Half of the audience was gone. Hollywood's golden age was slipping away, and the industry was shrinking. Studios cut costs, let go of staff, and sold off land that had once been used for iconic film sets. In 1947, Hollywood became the center of a political storm. The House Un-American Activities Committee, known as HUAC, launched an investigation into the film industry. They believed communist ideas were being spread through movies, and they were determined to stop it. What followed was one of the most damaging crackdowns on free speech in American history. The committee called 43 people to testify. Writers, directors, and actors were asked about their own beliefs and pressured to name others. Some cooperated, hoping to protect their careers. Others refused, believing the investigation was unfair. Among them were the Hollywood 10, a group of writers and directors who stood their ground. They argued that the First Amendment gave them the right to remain silent. HUAC disagreed. All 10 were convicted of contempt of Congress and sent to prison. Some served 6 months, others a full year. When they were released, they found themselves blacklisted, unable to find work in Hollywood. The hearings became a media spectacle. Some of Hollywood's biggest names took sides. Walt Disney and Ronald Reagan spoke in favor of the investigations, claiming communists were a real threat. Others like Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall protested, arguing that HUAC was destroying innocent lives. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the FBI gathered intelligence. Under J. Edgar Hoover's leadership, agents tapped phones and used informants to track suspected communists. The entire industry was caught in a wave of fear. Then came Red Channels, a pamphlet published in 1950. It named 151 people in radio, television, and film who were allegedly connected to communism. Studios took this list seriously. Those named were quietly pushed out of the industry, unable to find work. The blacklist grew, and by the mid-1950s, nearly 300 people had been banned from Hollywood. Writers avoided political themes in their scripts. Studios played it safe, focusing on patriotic films that wouldn't raise suspicion. For many, the blacklist meant the end of their careers. Dalton Trumbo, a member of the Hollywood 10, was one of its most famous victims. After serving time in prison, he found himself unemployable, but he refused to give up. Writing under fake names, he continued his work in secret. His scripts were so good that 2 of them won Academy Awards, one for Roman Holiday in 1953 and another for The Brave One in 1956. Both awards were credited to others. It wasn't until 1960 that Trumbo was finally given credit for his work, marking a turning point in Hollywood's blacklist era. Not everyone was as lucky. Actor John Garfield was repeatedly questioned about his political beliefs. The stress took its toll. He died of a heart attack at just 39. Actress Lee Grant's career was put on hold for over a decade after she spoke out against HUAC. Some left the country in search of work. Others took whatever jobs they could. Many turned to alcohol. Depression was common. The blacklist destroyed lives, both professionally and personally. Hollywood studios played a major role in enforcing the blacklist. In 1947, top executives met at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. There, they issued the Waldorf Statement, which banned the Hollywood 10 from working until they renounced communism. Studio heads like Louis B. Mayer and Jack Warner cooperated with HUAC, afraid that refusing would lead to financial losses. The American Legion and other groups added pressure by picketing films connected to blacklisted artists. The result was a Hollywood that played it safe, avoiding controversial topics and limiting artistic freedom. Screenwriter Richard Collins chose to testify before HUAC and name names. His wife refused. Their marriage fell apart. Actress Dorothy Cummingore, once a rising star after her role in Citizen Kane, was blacklisted and fell into alcoholism. She died at 58. Bartley Crum, a lawyer who defended the Hollywood 10, was placed under intense FBI surveillance. The pressure became too much. In 1959, he took his own life. Political activism in Hollywood also changed. Before the blacklist, many in the industry had supported civil rights and progressive causes. But during this era, speaking out was dangerous. Even those who were innocent feared being accused. Silence became the safest option. The blacklist finally began to break in 1960. Kirk Douglas and director Otto Preminger took a stand by openly crediting Trump. Built on spectacle. Big musicals and historical epics filled the screen with extravagant sets and massive casts. Movies like Gone with the Wind and Ben-Hur pushed budgets higher than ever before. At first, this worked. Audiences packed theaters, and studios made their money back. But by the late 1940s, things started to change. Production costs kept rising, and ticket sales weren't keeping up. A film like Ben-Hur cost $15 million to make, which would be over $150 million today. Even when these films were successful, the financial risks were growing too large to ignore. Then, television arrived. In 1950, only a small percentage of American homes had a TV. 5 years later, that number had exploded. More than half of all households had one, and suddenly, people didn't need to leave home for entertainment. Movie ticket sales dropped fast. Hollywood fought back by making movies bigger. Widescreen formats like CinemaScope promised a grander experience, something TV couldn't match. But making films this way only added to production costs. Some studios went all in and lost everything. Cleopatra was supposed to be a masterpiece, but its massive budget nearly destroyed 20th Century Fox. The industry was in trouble, and the old way of doing business wasn't working anymore. Hollywood had another problem. In 1948, a court ruling called the Paramount Decree forced studios to sell their theater chains. Before this, companies like MGM controlled everything. They made the movies, distributed them, and played them in their own theaters, guaranteeing success. Now, they had to compete for screen time. Independent filmmakers saw an opportunity. They didn't have big budgets, but they had something else: freedom. John Cassavetes was one of the first to take advantage. In 1959, he made Shadows for just $40,000. The film was different from anything Hollywood was making. It felt raw and real, and critics loved it. This opened the door for others. By the late 1960s, movies like The Graduate and Easy Rider proved that independent films could be massive hits. Audiences were changing. They wanted stories that felt personal, not just big-budget spectacles. For the big studios, everything became a gamble. Without their own theaters, they couldn't guarantee that their films would get shown. Even great movies weren't safe. MGM had built its reputation on musicals like Gigi, but by the gritty dramas and action films were taking over. Even when Hollywood made masterpieces, the financial risks were huge. Lawrence of Arabia was one of the greatest films ever made, but its massive budget meant it took years to turn a profit. Hollywood was falling apart. The old system that had controlled everything for decades was losing its grip. Studios that once dictated every move were struggling to keep up. Audiences wanted something different. They wanted movies that felt real, stories that spoke to them. A new generation of filmmakers saw the opportunity. They weren't studio executives or producers. They were young directors with bold ideas. Many had studied. Scorsese had learned filmmaking at New York University. Francis Ford Coppola had trained at the University of California, Los Angeles. They weren't following the old rules. They were making their own. Scorsese's Mean Streets felt like it had been pulled straight from the streets of New York. The dialogue was raw. The characters were deeply flawed. His next film, Taxi Driver, was even more intense. It followed a lonely war veteran drifting through the city, unraveling in the chaos around him. It was dark, it was unsettling, and audiences couldn't look away. Then there was Steven Spielberg. He didn't go to film school, but that didn't stop him. He had taught himself everything he knew. When he made Jaws, he turned a simple story about a killer shark into a cultural phenomenon. The tension, the fear, the way the camera made you feel like you were in the water with the characters. It changed movies forever. Francis Ford Coppola took storytelling to another level. The Godfather wasn't just a gangster movie, it was an epic. The kind of film that pulled you so deep into its world that you forgot you were watching fiction. Then came Apocalypse Now, a nightmarish journey through war and madness. The production nearly killed him, but he refused to give up. And then there was George Lucas. He loved mythology. He wanted to create something bigger than life. He took everything he had learned from old adventure serials and Japanese cinema and turned it into Star Wars. It wasn't just a movie, it was a universe. The characters, the music, the groundbreaking special effects. No one had ever seen anything like it. These filmmakers weren't working alone. They were friends. They helped each other. Spielberg gave advice on Star Wars. Lucas helped with The Godfather. They weren't competing. They were pushing each other forward. At the same time, something else was happening. Independent films were rising. Easy Rider was the spark. It was made for almost nothing but earned millions. It wasn't polished. It wasn't safe. It was wild, unpredictable, and honest. It captured the restless energy of the time, the feeling that the world was changing and no one knew what came next. The old Hollywood had been built on glamour. It gave people escape. But this new wave of filmmakers wasn't interested in that. They wanted truth. Movies like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate shattered expectations. They tackled rebellion at the old mold. This shift wasn't just creative, it was personal. The stars of this era weren't larger-than-life icons. They were real. They were messy. Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver, Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, Al Pacino in The Godfather. These weren't movie stars in the traditional sense. They weren't perfect, and that's why audiences connected with them. For the old Hollywood elite, this was the end. Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn. The actors who had once ruled the industry were being replaced by something new. Even behind the camera, legendary directors from the past struggled to keep up. The power had shifted. The studios no longer controlled everything. The filmmakers did. By the end of the 1970s, Hollywood had been transformed. The rules had changed. Movies had changed. The way stories were told would never be the same again.